All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Apiculture Online, Hive Chat with NC State. My name is David Tarpey. I'm professor in the apiculture program here at NC State and the extension apiculturist for cooperative extension. And we're joined here by our guests of honor, as well as other members of our apiculture program and the apiary inspection program of the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. So we're always like to have them on Zoom. And we always welcome our guests who are watching us on our live stream on our YouTube channel. There is a chat function there, so be sure to chat and put in any questions that you might have for our guests or any of our presenters tonight. We really have an excellent program tonight, a really special program, two guests from our horticulture department here at NC State. And we're going to be talking all about bee plants, which is quite clearly a professional and personal failing of mine. And so these are my go-to people whenever I have any similar questions posed to me about that subject. So I'm really excited and we're really honored to have Danesh, Seth, Carley, and Ann Spafford here to talk about that this evening. But first, what we're going to do, as always, is we're going to start with just some brief announcements, first of all, to have a very quick announcement that we are finally ready in opening up the state and in different extension activities. We're going to start our very popular intermediate bees academies again. So registration is now open for we're just going to have one bees academy this year rather than three like what we had before the pandemic. It's going to be held on Saturday and Sunday, October 2nd and 3rd at the Union County Extension Center in Monroe, which should have a very, very high capacity for attendance. So we should be able to scale depending on the enrollment very, very well. For those of you that are not familiar with these are kind of what we call a booster shot for your beginner bee school. So these are 2-day long extension trainings, in person and hands-on extension trainings, where you took your beginner bee school, you've been keeping bees for a couple years, but you feel like you need a little bit of a refresher, or you feel like you're plateauing on your ability to kind of continue your education and your experience with beekeeping. So this is really perfect for folks like that to try and kind of bring you to that next level. It's also really ideal for those of you that might be preparing to go from the certified level to the journeyman level of the state master beekeeper program. So be on the lookout for that. We'll probably do a lot more marketing and getting the word out about that. But if you want to check it out, go to our website or just Google Bees Academy, and you should be able to find the link and more information about it there. So the first segment that we always start out with here at Apiculture Online is the bees in season, which is in essence, what your honeybees are doing right now in the Southeast, and what you should be doing as a beekeeper in order to be assisting them and to be helping them and to get the most out of them. And so in late May here in at least the Piedmont of North Carolina, it has been a really strange winter and spring, right? It was the wettest winter, or at least close to the wettest winter historically on record. And then it's been exceedingly dry recently. And up until just a few days ago, it was still, kind of nightly lows were into the 40s and even though it's been getting hot during the day. So it's been a very strange kind of back and forth spring for the weather and for our bees. And so the consequence that has is that it affects their development and their growth. And so they haven't really kind of exploded out of their hives, which is a good and a bad thing. So one good thing is that we haven't seen kind of the unmitigated swarming rates that we often have this time of year, which is a good thing because that can add a lot of stressors to your colonies when your bees split in half, and then it takes a lot of time for them to recoup. A downside is that a lot of the main honey flows that were occurring over the last month or so, they've been muted, maybe a bit prolonged. So, I think in a lot of areas, the honey flow has been okay, but probably a bit below normal, or at least not typical of what you see in normal years. And so, that has, again, positive and negative effects. But in most cases, the main nectar flows are really wrapping up. We only have a couple more weeks for the bees to collect most of what they're going to be collecting this year, or at least until the summer. They're going to be busy ripening up the honey. The queen's going to start curtailing her egg laying rate. So the colony kind of population growth is going to really start to stabilize this time of year. So one thing that's really, really important for all of beekeeping is that, what your bees are doing right now is important, but what you project them to be doing 1 to 2 brood cycles from now, that is 3 to 6 weeks from right now, is what you can do best in order to set them up for success, right? If the colony is growing and you project them 1 to 2 brood cycles from now to be larger, then you want to give them extra brood boxes, right? If you see them kind of shrinking, you want to take those brood boxes away, right? So you always want to be kind of thinking 1 to 2 brood cycles ahead. And so, kind of in a month or so from now, you're not going to be needing to worry about swarming at all, right? So you're not going to have to do anything about, decongesting the brood nest so that they don't have that inner impulse to want to split. The swarming season is pretty much over, and you're not going to have to really focus on that. But as you might imagine, it's going to warm up. So what that means is that nature is going to kind of turn off like a tap. They're going to want to cool the hive down. So you want to make sure that they have a good, clean, close water source so that they're able to thermoregulate and to cool the hive down. As always, you want to be monitoring for mites, especially after the main honey flows. There's really no excuse to go in or to not go in and to take a sample of varroa mites and make sure that they're still kind of under threshold and not going to cause problems for your bees. And, once the nectar flows are over, then, the bees can often turn on each other. If you have a relatively large apiary, or if you have large colonies and small colonies, you want to make sure that the larger colonies don't rob out and pick on those smaller colonies. So put on your robber screens and just kind of pay that extra attention to detail to make sure that you don't have inciting robbing among your colonies or between yours and your neighbors. If you can get your hands on them, or if you're raising your own, midsummer and kind of late summer can be a good time to requeen your colonies. It kind of gives a brood break within the colonies, which can help to deter the growth of the mites within the colonies. It allows that queen to kind of get established, and then easier to make it through the winter so that she's really kind of in her prime kind of the following spring. But again, I'd say that that's not for beginners. It's probably for more experienced beekeepers, and only if you're in that practice of doing that this time of year. One thing that I see a lot of beekeepers not doing, or at least not taking advantage of, is, if you have your bees in a particular location and they have a very good spring nectar flow, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good place to have them during the summer. And so, consider moving your hives from, the location that they overwintered in, or they're in the spring where they may be doing well, but they don't do very well in the summer. And if you move your hives to somewhere where there's a good summer nectar flow, even, crops, certain crops like canola, if you can find it, or even things like cotton can be a good kind of midsummer location for them to get some nectar, where otherwise they would just be dipping into their honey stores. Consider at least temporarily moving your hives so that you can take advantage of those other flows so that your bees aren't as nutritionally stressed. You can always move them back after, that kind of stressful time during the summer is over. But again, we're going to be heading into the season where things are going to get a little more difficult for the bees, because there's just not as much forage out there for them. And so you're going to have to remain fairly vigilant on the bees and their health, and especially the mites, as we start to get into late summer and into the fall. So with that, I'm going to just cut to the chase and get to our main event, where I'm going to hand things over to our two guests of honor here. Typically in Apiculture Online, our second segment is a timely topic where we present something, some new research or a new topic, a new finding, a new way of doing things. And then the third segment, we interview a guest of honor and we just talk about some of the things that they have going on. We're merging these two segments tonight, and we're asking our two guests of honor to actually present as well as kind of interview and discuss the topic at hand today, which is pollinator gardening for the South. Both Dr. Danesh Seth Carley and Dr. Ann Spafford have recently published this excellent book. Anybody who's into bees, gardening, or especially both should get their hands on a copy of this. I'll make sure I put a link to that in the chat on our YouTube channel. It's just really fantastic. A lot of people are always asking questions about this, and I'm always falling short. And so I'm always turning to these two for answers to this question. So this is a very, very timely time for this to come out. So I'm going to hand it over to Danesh, and she'll start her presentation, and let's talk about bee plants.
Awesome. David, thank you so much for that introduction. And if you don't already have a copy of our book, message me later and let me know. I'm happy to send you a comped copy, or just to have an extra one kicking around your lab, let me know. Thank you so much for having us. We're always happy to talk about our book, but also Ann and I very much love to talk about just gardening in general with a focus on pollinator habitats. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And if I can go ahead and get my screen to work. So you guys are all very familiar with the darling of agriculture, shown here in the top left of our screen, the little honeybee there. And you are also probably aware of all of the other insects and animals on the screen are also pollinators. Some of them, of course, are much more efficient pollinators than others, honeybees or bees in general being the most efficient pollinator. And then, believe it or not, flies, shown here lower left corner, and then this hoverfly here in the middle on the yellow squash plant. There is also a fly. Sometimes that's called a hoverfly, believe it or not. But they're actually the second most efficient pollinators for our landscape and agricultural crop plants. Other insects and animals shown here are also pollinators. Although if you get me in a bar over a glass of wine, I'll strenuously argue that butterflies should not be considered pollinators, or at least no better pollinator than my dog, who might walk through my garden and shed some pollen from one plant to another. But that's another day and another discussion. So when Ann and I are talking about pollinator-friendly plants or pollinator-friendly design in your landscape, for the most part, we're talking about bees, but anytime you would like to bring additional wildlife like butterflies, like birds, like bats to your garden, they're all going to be looking for the same nutritional sources. And that's typically pollen, or especially in the case of butterflies, they're going to be looking for nectar. So what we're talking about, we might say bees, we might say butterflies, we might say birds. But the information that we're going to share with you this evening is germane to any of your favorite pollinators, be them efficient or inefficient pollinators. So you guys already know this. Honeybees are so very, very important for agriculture worldwide. And that is true, of course, even though honeybees are not native to North America. But we really count on them. And one of the cool things I think about honeybees is that we can actually manage them in hives, and they can move from place to place. And so I always like to think about the honeybee as sort of like tiny cattle, where they're all living together and you can put them on a truck if you need to and move them around. But regardless of that, they are incredibly important to agriculture, not just because I like to eat and most of the food I eat, I need bees for, but also economically, they're incredibly important. And this number is a little bit old now, but economists tell us that the estimated annual benefits, that means yearly benefit of managed honeybees to American agriculture, is over 1.6 billion dollars. And that's a lot. And of course, that doesn't take into account backyard beekeepers and how important your bees are as well. So this number is probably a little bit low, actually, on the benefit of agriculture, because again, your bees are traveling to other fields and they're pollinating urban gardens and your garden and your neighbor's gardens. And so we can't just talk about the importance of the honeybee in terms of economics, but they are incredibly important for agriculture and the American agricultural system in general. So native bees also very, very important. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about native bees. Many of you are probably familiar with some of the bees shown on this slide. You can see in the lower left on the butterfly weed, the bombus, our little honeybee there, is feeding on that nectar. But here are some other very prominent native bees that we see in North Carolina: the megachile, the agapostemon, that really shiny sweat bee up there on that gaillardia, and then that little halictus down there on the cosmos. In fact, in North America alone, we have over 4,000 native bee species, and they're all out there working side by side with your honeybees, trying to pollinate flowers and helping the American agricultural institution. One of the things that's exceptionally special about North Carolina is that we actually have one of the most diverse native bee communities in the nation. We have over 500 native bees just in North Carolina alone. So those little bees are working really hard as well, right alongside those honeybees. No matter what bees you have or want to bring to your garden, honeybees, megachile, other bees, the bombus is one of my very favorite bees. They're all visiting those drive-ins, those flowers, for the same things. They're either looking for carbohydrates, which are sugars essentially that they get from nectar, or they're looking for protein and fats, which they're going to get from pollen. And depending on what they need at their particular time of day or of the brood cycle or whatnot, they're going to be looking for different things, but they're always looking for one of those two things when they're visiting those flowers. So you guys are all probably very, very aware that bee populations worldwide are in decline. It isn't one quick, easy answer to tell anybody, oh, well, bees are dying because of this one reason. I would say that it's essentially a host of reasons, right? And some of them are described here in this pie chart that I have here. You guys are all very familiar with the difficulty of pests getting into your hives. I know Dave was talking about the varroa mites earlier, and I know that honeybees are unfortunately very attractive to other types of pests as well, small hive beetle and others. That and diseases certainly contribute to the decline in populations, especially if your populations are under any kind of stress. And so that's going to exacerbate the issue and cause larger declines in those populations. Climate change can impact your hives and native bees as well, primarily because of the fluctuations in temperature and in weather. Also, it goes pretty much without saying these days, everyone's pretty aware that pesticides can definitely damage bees and bee health in general. But those are not the only causes. And one of the big causes that Ann and I talk about a lot is actually urbanization. And while that can be a bad thing when it comes to bee habitat, Ann and I are here to talk to you about how we can actually offset the negativity of the loss of feeding and nesting habitats for bees and the subsequent decline in populations, because we can help to add habitat back into our spaces that will then benefit your bees, whether it be a honeybee or, as I mentioned, the other native bees, or butterflies or beetles or flies, or whichever your favorite pollinator is. So that's essentially what Ann and I are just going to talk about, is that how we can offset that negativity of urbanization. And you're pretty much on your own on the other things. I don't know anything more about bee diseases than what you heard me talk about just now. That's where you go to David for.
That's another show.
I'm going to talk. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I'm saying that's another show.
Yeah, that's another podcast. Come back next week. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that if you're thinking about planting for bees with bees in mind, or again, other pollinators, I'm going to give you just 4 tips, easy, quick, and dirty to remember. And no matter what your gardening skill or level is, don't be afraid, you can do it. Okay, I know that you can't. So just walk with us through the rest of the talk and you'll be an expert pollinator gardener by the end. So the first thing is honeybees and other bees, bumblebees, for example, also follow the rule of what we call floral constancy. And you guys as beekeepers probably are already aware of this, but most of the public that I'm speaking with aren't familiar with this term, floral constancy. And if there's one or two of you out there who aren't familiar, I'll just remind you that essentially what that means is that bees on any given trip are going to prefer to go to the same type of plant. Makes sense if you think about that term, floral constancy. So if you're looking at this landscape picture that I have here, this is actually a golf course that I was working on fairly recently, but you'll notice that this planting has this mass of this red and yellow plant, which is actually Gaillardia or Indian blanket. There in the foreground, that isn't one plant, that's actually many plants grouped together. And you can see sort of in these plantings that it isn't individual plants, and indeed they are grouped together. And not only is that in many cases aesthetically attractive, although there are certainly other ways to do things, but it also allows the bees, those little ladies, to work just a little less hard when they're out there looking for pollen on those individual plants. We tend to recommend that you plant in clumps and offset some of the hard work that those ladies are out there doing when they're collecting pollen. Something else we always recommend is to keep a little journal with you. I carry my gardening journal with me everywhere. It's kind of a joke now to my family, in a good way, of course, but they're always like, oh, I bet you know when that started blooming. I bet you wrote it down. I like to keep records from year to year because, as David mentioned earlier, you know, while it's May in North Carolina, this May is very different from last May, and it might be very different from the May before. So I always like to keep records of dates when the plants are blooming, just so that I know that I've always got resources for bees in my garden. And again, that can change from week to week or year to year. But if you're keeping a journal, it's kind of neat because you can keep track. You can also, as you go, you know, around your neighborhood, if you're walking your dog in the evening, you can pull out your little gardening journal and write down maybe some of the things that you're seeing bees forage on in your neighbor's yard. And then you can always go to a nursery or garden center and buy some of those plants, add them to your garden as inspiration. And also, Ann and I are going to talk about a lot of different plants, and you're going to see a lot of lists, especially if you go online. Everyone has their own opinion about favorite pollinator plants. And that's actually one of the reasons Ann and I wrote this book, was so that we have a place, one place, where you can have an expert advice on the different types of plants that are actually grounded in science. It's not just Ann and I have a gut feeling that that's good for bees. We've actually done the science and the research behind it. But that said, don't be afraid to be different. Don't be afraid to go off script. The bees don't read our book. They have no idea what we tell you is good for them. So don't be afraid to try new plants. And if you don't see bees foraging on it, maybe you'll see something else. Maybe in the evening moths will come, or maybe you'll be bringing a different type of native bee species that you don't often see. So don't be afraid to be different, go off script. Solitary bees also need places to live. You guys keep your bees in hives and hope that they stay there, but solitary bees often have to find their own places to live. Sometimes they're going to live in holes made by other bees. Sometimes they're going to hollow out some grass stems, as this little mason bee here is poking his little head out of that grass stem. Yellow-faced bees also like to drill holes in those hollow grass stems and lay their eggs in there and make that their home as well. Some, of course, like the digger bees, will nest in the ground if it's the right facing slope in your yard. And so if you're sensitive to making sure that there are good places in your yard for solitary bees to nest, we like to recommend that you don't put down heavy mulch, or at least leave some areas clear of mulch if you notice that bees are nesting there. And we never recommend adding plastic to your landscape. It's nice at first, it does keep the weeds down, but it really can it can create environmental waste, and it also gives the bees no place to go. Something else I like to talk about, and I won't spend too much time on this evening, but these are pictures from my lawn. And I always have the neighbors' bees in my yard in full force. They love the clover, and they love the dandelions. And I used to argue with my husband all the time. He would get frustrated because I wouldn't let him mow the lawn very often. And actually, this used to be grassy. And because I like to sort of skip the lawn mowing more regularly, and I live in a neighborhood where people don't look down their nose on us when we have dandelions in our yard and even clover, it's because once I educated my husband about the fact that these little clover, and especially that dandelion, are so very important for the different stages of, in particular, honeybees. And I know especially the pollen is a very high quality from the dandelions that you see, especially during brood rearing. And then the clover that you see here doesn't get very tall, so it's not terribly obtrusive. And it provides very rich pollen for the whole entire season. It's also quite heat and drought tolerant. So I mostly just tell folks, one of the easiest way to add additional habitat to your yard is to carve out a little area and just sort of stop mowing it or mow it less frequently. You can even go as far as to seed a little bit of clover into your yard if you can get away with it, or if your husband or your wife or your partner doesn't mind. And just tell them that it's not weeds, it's bee habitat. Anne's going to talk a little bit more about this, and I know that David talked about it early on. Seasonality is so, so important. Remember, the reason we want to make sure that we have healthy forage for the bees is to keep them healthy, right? And that means we need to keep them healthy when they're coming out of the hive, when they're foraging all year long, they're in the heat of the summer, and all the way through the fall. And so we can't decide for them when they need the most energy, right, which they're getting from nectar. They don't necessarily know when they're out there collecting pollen. And when we're talking about honeybees, it's a lot easier to see the cycles for them. And our solitary bees, which are also so very important in our landscape, are also out there at different times of the year at different cycles. And so having nectar available, pollen available year round, or as much of the year as we can, is very, very important to keep our bees healthy. Something else I know that David mentioned was making sure you have a water source. I'm sorry, and now I'm embarrassed. These are my cute little water sources for just folks who want to put a little water element in their yard when they're applying for a natural habitat certification. Or I just have this little bottom from one of my ceramic pots with some stones in it. I always have bees visiting, but I'm not a beekeeper. So you guys are going to need to think about something a lot more robust than these cute little water sources. But for most homeowners who don't have bees, some of these artistic design elements go really nicely in their gardens. And so we always want to remind people, bees and pollinators, just like people, pretty much have three basic needs. They need a nice place to live, they need food, and they need water, and they need healthy, clean water. David, I actually have a question. When I was researching different ways for folks to water their bees, I saw one article that actually mentioned adding salt water to the water. Is that recommended or not recommended?
It's not necessary. That's a great question, Danesh. We actually have a whole recording on this from, I think, last summer. It was a timely topic when you were talking about making sure you can provide water for your bees. We also were talking about it earlier this year about how to kind of keep bees away from your neighbor's swimming pool.
Right.
So if you're interested in those as a beekeeper, go and look at our YouTube recordings from previously. But in essence, you're right that most of the time the bees need the water to cool down or just to drink. But it's also an important source of salts. So they don't get a lot of salts necessarily. Well, pollens vary, as you well know, in their micronutrients and whatnot. And so sometimes the salts just aren't there in their diet. And so they do need it. They do get it from their water, but it can be hit or miss. So it's not obligatory that you add salt.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for clearing that up, because I talk a lot about water and the importance of having water. And then I thought, oh my goodness, have I been missing something all this time? Thank you. And a lot of people you'll see butterflies sometimes, but often butterflies will be coming to areas I'll notice where I've left the hose dripping and it's sort of dripping into this organic matter that's in my backyard, and butterflies will come and they're actually, it's called puddling, and they're actually drinking minerals, I guess, out of that water. And I bet bees probably do something very similar. But now I'm outside of my comfort zone. I'm sticking with the script. So don't forget to make sure that you have a water element in your garden or nearby, so that you are providing healthy, clean water, right? Clean water for your bees. One other thing I like to mention is that nobody likes mosquitoes. And so you have to be aware when you're offering a water source, you don't want to have a source where you're going to also be breeding mosquitoes, because you will not be a fan with your neighbors if you're bringing extra mosquitoes. I love all things big and small, but I do not love mosquitoes. So don't bring mosquitoes. Okay, picking my very favorite pollinator plants. So Ann and I both, you know, we talk about this all the time. We're like, how do you pick your favorite plants? It's like picking your favorite child. I have an only son, so I'm allowed to do that, but most people cannot pick a favorite child. It's not cool. So why do I have this list of 5 pollinator plants? Everyone always wants to know, what are your favorite plants? What are your favorite plants? These are not my favorite plants necessarily because I like the way they look, although I have to admit, I love all these plants and I love the way they look. But primarily, I'm recommending these plants because A, they're all natives, although I'm not someone who recommends only natives, because bees, frankly, as long as they have high quality pollen and nectar, they don't care if the plant is native or not. But these happen to be all natives. They're easy to grow in your landscape, and they're all perennials. Most importantly, they provide either high quality pollen, nectar, or both. And as David alluded to earlier, we know this because we actually took the time to gather pollen from individual plants and then process it, looking at everything from amino acid content to sugar content, et cetera. So, you know, not all pollen is created equal. So when Ann and I are talking about good pollinator plants, we're only going to recommend plants that also provide high quality pollen for your bees. And these are some of my favorites. And then just very lastly, lots of people really like butterflies. And so I'll just remind you that if you like pollinators in general, please be very, very judicious in your use of pesticides or herbicides in your yard. It's best actually if you don't use any. And I don't have any problem with people using them in their yard if they're extremely careful and they're smart about it. But unfortunately, not everybody is. Or consider putting a sign up in your yard, especially if you're a beekeeper, to remind people that just because they're treating their yard doesn't mean that the pesticide or the cloud of drift is going to respect that property line. So remind people that you have bees and that those herbicides or pesticides can be very damaging to your bees. And then as I started earlier, if you really love butterflies, one of my favorite ways to bring butterflies to the garden is to include host plants. Larval host plants are going to bring these caterpillars. It's really easy to plant passion flower. I always plant dill and fennel in my garden. I tell my husband it's so that we can add it to our potato salad, but that's mostly a bald-faced lie. It's mostly because I love to bring caterpillars to the garden, and they always eat my dill and fennel, and then they, you know, pupate into these beautiful butterflies and fly away. So bring some extra interest into your yard by adding larval host plants. So I've told you a little bit about the elements that you want to bring into your garden if you want to have a fabulous pollinator garden. And that's just what I gave you. I gave you sort of the bare bones of what you want to bring into the garden. So now my lovely co-author Ann is going to tell you how to take that how to wow.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Oh, no, go back to that other slide. Sorry, I deleted one, trying to streamline. So one of my very, very favorite things about landscape design is that it is so flexible and you can phase in any kind of garden, including a pollinator garden, over time. And it's not like if you're, building an addition to your house, once you start, you have to finish. With landscaping, you can add a little bit at a time. And as you phase it in, if it's done correctly, your garden just looks better and better, but it never has to look incomplete at any one time. So that's one of the things that I absolutely love about landscape design. And one of the best places to start is with areas of turf, right? Especially if it's a turf area that's not being used, right? So say in your backyard, you have turf, it's like kid running around space, pet running around space, totally fine. You use that turf. In the front yard, however, we're putting so many resources and inputs into that turf, but we're not really using it. So that's not really a great way to use your landscape. And it's not very environmentally friendly. We would love to say, just get rid of all the turf. That's not very realistic. So a better way to do it is just think about how you can add some pollinator habitat. So what I'm showing in these three images are a front yard, like typical front yard, new construction in a plan view. So like, I was gonna say the bird's eye view, but let's just say the bee's eye view, right? And so you're looking down, the one on the left is like the bare bones design, right? So it's just some foundation plantings right up at the house, and then one tree in the front yard. That's all that developers are required to put in. Maybe they're great looking plants, maybe they're not so great looking plants, but let's just assume that they're good ones, right? You don't have to get rid of those. That actually can be a good base. So like you've got some evergreen backdrop, awesome. Now let's come in and layer in some of those pollinator plants. So if you go to the second drawing, all I'm showing is bringing out those garden beds. And now we can work in some perennials that give you added color, that provide that pollen and nectar for the pollinators that Danesh talked about. If you want to go like full throttle, or maybe in like year 3, you can bring the bed line out all the way to the tree. And so now you don't have to mow around the tree, right? Hooray, says someone who absolutely hates to mow, right? And so now you've incorporated all this extra pollinator habitat. You've reduced your turf a little bit. However, this is still a very HOA friendly landscape design, right? So you wouldn't have any trouble passing this. And it also eventually will be lower maintenance for you, right? So once those plants fill in, they've established good root systems, you don't have to fuss over those plants. So one of the things that Danesh and I talk about in the book is, of all the plants that we're recommending, none of them are fussy plants, right? We want you to have success with them. So once these plants get established, you really don't have to do a whole lot to them, but now you don't have to mow that extra turf, right? So every little bit helps. All right, so what I think is really interesting is bees and humans really like the same kinds of things in a garden design, albeit for very different reasons. So pollinators want different flowers, flower shapes and sizes. We as humans like lots of color. That translates to drama in the garden, right? We love color. We love, having our, visual attention arrested, right? Pollinators, they need to have pollen and nectar sources spring through fall. We like to have a garden that's showy as much of the year as possible. So that means in a garden design, we have to carefully curate wave after wave of blooming times. And that may come from trees, shrubs, as well as perennials. Our native bees need some winter habitat. So we typically work that in with ornamental grasses, which also gives us some winter interest, which is very necessary. And then, as Danesh mentioned, bees need a diversity of flowers for the best nutrition. And again, we like lots of interest in our garden, so that tends to mean high diversity of plantings. And the diagrams on the right I tell my students that they're really all correct and good ways of designing. So there's a little plan view vignette on the left and an elevation view, or what they look like from the side on the right side. And all of those could be correct depending on the context and your design goals. However, if you're designing for bees, you really want to go down to the bottom vignettes, right? That have layers of plant material that with more plant diversity that will inherently bring in seasonal blooms for the pollinators. So you do want to think about your design strategy, right? What do you want your pollinator garden to look like? And what I'm showing on this slide are several different approaches. Like the one on the far left is very naturalistic. It is human built, but it was done by an ecologist. And actually the way that it's been created, it actually meets her city's yard guidelines, except for like in one aspect, right? But her neighbors complained. And so now she's been in a battle with her city for years. And what's interesting is people love the idea of supporting pollinators, They love the idea of naturalistic gardens. However, people really are only equipped or prepared to like what nature looks like when they're in nature. As soon as you come into a residential yard, the gloves come off, man. And so you have to be a little bit careful about what your yard looks like, and do it in an ecologically sensitive way, but also in a way that fits with the context. So for Nina Marie Lister's garden, even if she had a neat and tidy edge of like a native evergreen shrub, just to contain that wildness, what people really are after are what's called cues to care. They want it to look like it's a deliberately crafted garden, right? So a lot of times you can have a garden that's wild as all get out, but as long as it has a neat and tidy edge, all things are good. I actually teach a landscape design class for non-majors in the summer, and I start by having them find images of landscapes they find attractive online, and they need to share those with me and tell me why they think they're attractive. And silly me, I always think they're going to say, because it's beautiful, it's colorful, it's lush. Nope, neat, clean, and tidy are the top answers. And it's been like 9 years running. It's like, what? Don't you realize that you're in an outdoor setting and it's okay to be a little, no, gotta be neat, clean, and tidy. So you have to sort of bridge ecological principles with good landscape design, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Some other ways of designing your pollinator garden could be the massed approach or the clumped approach, which Danesh mentioned, and that's sort of in the middle image. Although that image is for like a very large scale garden. So imagine if this was for your home landscape, it would just be smaller clumps. But you can see very deliberate massings. That's not going to happen in nature like that, right? So again, very human built, but it is more naturalistic, but it's a cleaner look than say the image on the left. And then the one on the far right, still a Pete Udolph design. I'm a huge fan of his. If there were garden groupies, I would totally be one. But the image on the far right is the way that Pete, because we're on a first name basis, designs gardens now. And it's more of an intermingled approach. Looks completely naturalistic, but rest assured, every plant has been planned where it's going to go. And you probably still have floral constancy because it's the same number of, say, cone flowers in there, but they're just spread out a little bit, right? So instead of having the next flower right next door, the female bee just has to fly a few more feet, right? So it's still not a great distance. You're still not expending, hopefully, way more energy, but it's just really aesthetics at this point. So it's like what floats your boat and what's going to be okay with your neighbors, right? So generally, I love to show this Venn diagram because the most sustainable and most like socially acceptable landscape design will occur where principles of ecological design and good landscape design overlap. So that means high plant diversity, no monocultures, or very little monocultures when it comes to turf, and then layering of plant types to support insect and animal ecology. However, you now need to make it look like it has structure that is obviously made and contains at least some neat and orderly elements, the cues to care that I mentioned. This is my, fairly wild garden, however you want to describe it. I think it's awesome, but I'm not biased in any way, shape, or form. This is my small front yard garden in Raleigh. And yes, the perennial beds are pretty wild, but it's bordered on one edge by the street. It goes right up to the curb. And then I do have perfect squares of turf that have a paver edging, right? But then it's wild in there and it looks awesome. My neighbors love it. Granted, I don't have an HOA, right? But I think it would be fine even if I was in another kind of neighborhood. And I have used tons of diversity. I do have things blooming from spring through frost, like Danesh mentioned, but I also have carefully repeated key plantings, like the purple coneflower. It's repeated in actually 90 places, if you're counting, right? Just because when we look at a design, our brain is trying to understand. It's like, okay, have I seen that before? Do I recognize it? Yep, I've seen that, I've seen that, I've seen that. And so repetition is a really key factor when it comes to designing any landscape, and even a pollinator garden. So I have like 90 cone flowers in my front yard, and it helps bring the eye around. So it's not like, 1,000 different things. It's actually, 200 things, but groups of things. Next slide, please. And so the other thing we like to promote is any garden, of course, should be beautiful. To me, that seems to be like the lowest common denominator or the lowest hanging fruit. So of course, if it's designed well, it should be beautiful. But we really want to have any garden that we create be as high functioning as possible. So of course, let's say this is a pollinator habitat. And the picture that I'm showing you here is a garden that Danesh and I built with students on the roof of one of the roofs of our Carley Student Center here on NC State's campus. It's on the 5th floor. It's the smallest roof section. All the roof sections are outfitted to be green roof ready. So we're excited to keep going with the green roofs. But this is a pollinator habitat, but it is also a way of mitigating stormwater runoff, right? If our garden filled up every square foot of this space, it would reduce heating and cooling loads on the building, although we have lots of paths to make this a living lab and allow people out there, so we couldn't do that. It reduces glare. When we first actually put this in, it had been like a white roof for I don't know, like 2 years, I think, Danesh, right? And then we just brought up the trays and we filled them with soil, and they sat like that for 4 months before we did any planting. And the people who look out at that were like so thankful, because even though it was just soil, they're like, thank God, the white was blinding, right? So now having plants out there also helps to reduce the glare. And then the people that get to look out onto this garden have reported to us that it improves their mood, it helps to refocus their attention, and of course it brings joy, right? So again, any garden, maybe it starts as a pollinator garden, but what other aspects can we layer on to make it as functional and more impactful as possible? All right, so yes, Danesh mentioned designing for seasonality. This is absolutely key. And unfortunately, I think it's one of the hardest things to wrap our brains around, especially for my poor students who, when they have me for planting design, they have just gotten through our year-long plant ID class, and they're just struggling to hang on and be able to ID the plants, let alone know how to use them in design. And a lot of times when we're trying to plan for seasonality, we want to say, okay, what does this plant look like when it's in bloom? But what does it look like when it's done in terms of the aesthetics of the whole garden? And no catalog is going to show you what the plant looks like throughout the year. They only will focus on the bloom. So this is why I love Danesh's idea of keeping a journal, because it will help you track, okay, the flowers came out in spring, and then when they were done, then there was this really nice light green rounded leaf plant for a while, and then like the seed pods came out, right? And so you're not going to find that tracked very well on the internet or in any book. But if you do the journal, you can track that, or you can do the lazy journaling like I do. And I just use my iPhone and I just chart everything. And then I can quickly look up, when I took that picture, and eventually I'll like download all those pictures and I'll categorize them on my computer. But when I'm designing, and the way I teach my students is, as we're crafting like a garden bed or a landscape plan, just as you're coming up with plants, make a list off to the side, and then do like a visual chart of spring, summer, fall, and winter. And that's what I'm showing in that middle, like chicken scratch note thing. And just highlight when the plant is either evergreen for like human interest, and when it is providing pollen and nectar for our pollinator friends. So in this aspect, it acts as a design tool, because if I finish my rough draft of my plan and there's hardly anything blooming in spring, that's a mistake. And I need to go back and address that before I build this garden. Actually, before I even finish the plan, right? I've got to fix that while I'm designing. Then it's also a really handy communication tool if you're designing for others or explaining to others about the work you've done in your own garden, because then I bring it into a Word document, I create tables, and I still do it graphically, So when I'm communicating to many of my design clients who aren't plant people, the plant names aren't as critical as being able to look at that beautiful chart saying, oh my gosh, she has worked in something going on every month of the year, right? So you can understand that in 10 seconds, right? So it's a really, really handy tool. But seasonality is definitely critical. So I have a few more plants. I know we're only presenting a short time. If we really wanted to know all of our favorite plants, we would be on one of these like marathon sessions, right? So we've actually just culled it down to the most, right? And they're also in the book. Thank you, Danesh, for that plug. And so again, the reason why I love these plants is not just because I like them, and that's something I educate my students on as well. It's like when we're designing for others, you don't put in plants because you like them unless you're planning on moving in with your client, right? Not recommended, right? So we put them in because they are, of course, they're going to support pollinators, but they're gorgeous. They're tough plants, but not invasive or too terribly bossy. They're easy to grow. They don't require chemicals in any way, shape, or form. So there's a reason why they're on these lists. So for spring, these are some of my favorites. So of course, I'm just a plant nerd all the way around, and I always jump into perennials. So our Eastern Columbine, as David mentioned, it's been a really weird spring. I still have some blooming. Isn't that weird? Usually they're long gone by now. And the rest of my garden is like slowly coming online. Usually it's like going gangbusters by now, but it's just, I think the rain we got this afternoon and the high temps just is going to kick it into high gear. But the Eastern Columbine is fabulous. It spreads readily, but not in a bossy way. And it's so ephemeral, like even the foliage goes away once it's done. So it's not anything, it's not going to take over your garden in any way, shape, or form. Golden Alexander is another one. Excellent, super early bloomer, and then it'll also bloom sporadically later on in the season. It's also a larval food source for a butterfly, but Danesh, maybe you can help me out. I don't retain the butterfly stuff at all.
One of the swallowtails, but you got what was most important.
Thank you, exactly. The crane's bill is an excellent, another little short spreader, absolutely beautiful. I actually just bought some more this weekend down at Big Bloomers. The false indigo is beautiful. Beard tongue is one of my favorite. That's a great native. It blooms later spring. These beautiful triangular clusters of pink flowers. Blueberries, of course, because I don't want to be like a perennial bias. I had to throw in like at least one shrub. And then if we think about, we don't need to support the pollinators only with our garden, right? There's so many plants out there. So one of the earliest blooming trees I could think of was the red maple. And those are ubiquitous, right? So they're getting plenty of pollen and nectar when they first emerge, right? So maybe you don't have room in your garden for a red maple, totally fine. There's probably not one too far from your yard. And then of course, the beautiful red bud. So these are just some early spring blooming plants that would look amazing in your garden. Go to the next slide. We can move on to the summer blooming plants. And so, thanks. Like Danesh, pycnanthemum or the mountain mint is at the top of my list. And you might be thinking, and come on, is that really a gorgeous plant? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? So I do think it's beautiful. Other people might disagree, totally fine. But it's also interesting in that you might have read about plants that bees prefer being like the vibrant colored ones. And while that's certainly true, I think what's more important is that they're attracted to the nectar guides or the contrasting colors that we don't see, because this mountain mint is one of the best pollinator plants. I have some in my yard, and at any one time in the summer, and it goes all summer, there are probably at least 15 species of pollinators on it. And I can be weeding right under it, like knocking the plant with my elbow, never been stung, knock on wood, because they don't care about me, right? They're not defending anything at that point. So it's a beautiful plant. But what I really love about it is that grayish foliage. And it actually acts as a beautiful foil for all those other hot colors that you're seeing on the screen, right? So you have like the screaming red bee balm and the Joe Pye weed and the electric orange butterfly weed. Sometimes if you mass all those really hot, vibrant colors together, it's a bit much to take in. So you can like interweave some gray in there, and that acts as a good buffer. It's almost like a visual spoonful of sherbet on a hot summer day, right? It's just like a break for your eyes, right? So I love it for that reason. And then one of my favorites is on the bottom, the rattlesnake master. It's getting ready to bloom in my yard, which is really weird because that's usually later, right? Everything is out of whack, but like the foliage came up earlier and the flower buds are just starting to emerge, but they look like this little weird Sputnik thing, right? And they're white. And so you wouldn't think that bees would be attracted to it. Think again, they love this plant. And they're all over it every summer. So I can't wait for it to start to bloom. I love planting it with ornamental grasses around it. So you've got these Sputnik things coming up out of the grass. Really gorgeous. All right, next slide. I know we're running out of time. And then it's really critical to think of late summer and fall blooming pollinator plants, because as you may remember, that's when, you know, temperatures are skyrocketing. We tend to have a little bit, or we go for longer without periods of rain. So our gardens start to give up the ghost. But this is when pollinators really need our help, right? So our native asters are fabulous. Just be sure to give them some room. Whatever the plant label says in terms of width, I would give it a little bit more because they are sort of rambling spreaders, not invasive, but they just take up a lot of room in the garden. So you just need to plan for that. Goldenrod, you really can't beat it for the display and the time of year. However, it's pretty bossy. That's our polite way of saying it's aggressive and it will take over. So in my garden, I put it in a pot. Although on my plant buying expedition this past weekend, I found a new cultivar called Little Miss Sunshine. It's only supposed to be 12 to 18 inches tall and wide. And the label said not as aggressive. But again, bees don't read the labels. So I don't really put a lot of stock into that. So we'll just have to see. And then of course, purple coneflower, it's still going. Like mine just started. They will go all the way through till frost. Absolutely amazing. And then,
I'm sorry. Yeah. I was just going to offer that the purple coneflower, and as you recall, you know, it also, once the seed heads die, right, it offers all those seeds for those beautiful little chickadees or goldfinch. I always see goldfinch, and I bet you get a lot of them in your yard. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you. I was just so excited about the additional wildlife feeding of the echinacea.
I know, that's great. I'm so focused on bees right now that's a valid point. So I'm glad you interjected. The last plant I have on this slide is hyssop, and this is a non-native plant. And so I like that Danesh mentioned that when it comes to pollen and nectar, bees don't really care if a plant is native or not. It's not like they're flying around with little passports in their pockets, right? So, you know, native plants are very important for the lower trophic levels. And for example, everybody knows that monarchs will only lay their eggs on Asclepias, so that type of thing. So those host plant things are very important. But in terms of pollen and nectar, I hate the idea of people excluding really good plants just because they're not native. In fact, some natives are much harder to get established in a garden, and some of these non-natives are very well behaved. They perform beautifully. So to exclude them just seems like you're selling the pollinators a bit short.
Especially since honeybees are not native. Right? They didn't read the book about native versus non-native.
Exactly. So next slide, please. I will say that, you know, you want to be a little careful with the cultivars that you're buying. The research that we found showed that the straight species of a plant has higher quality pollen. And so a lot of times when we're breeding for certain new plant characteristics that we want, you win some characteristics, you lose some others. And so pollen quality sometimes goes down. But you also want to look at the flower form that's being created. So you can see the picture on the left. That's very easily accessible pollen and nectar. The new cultivars, and I don't know, I think these look a little weird, but to each his or her own, but these are very popular with a lot of consumers. But the image on the right is like, think about a bee trying to access pollen and nectar. It's a lot of work. And who knows if the juice is worth the squeeze, right? The quality there might not be very much pollen and nectar. There might not be high quality pollen in there, right? So it's better to make sure that you're looking at flower forms that are easily accessible to our pollinator friends. And then, sorry, I have to add the winter interest. I know this is like a honeybee thing, but working in some ornamental grasses, it gives us structure in the winter, right? So all of these beautiful grasses that are varied textures and sizes and forms, they go dormant, right? So that means the form, the height is still in play in the winter. They still move in the wind, which is lovely. And then again, some of our native bees will actually like overwinter or lay eggs in the hollow stems. So that's another reason to incorporate some ornamental grasses. Plus, they're tough as nails, right? This is a plant you only have to prune once a year, right? In late winter, early spring, you just cut them back once and that's it. Then they start growing again, right? So any plant that you got to touch once a year, that's a great plant in my book. Next slide, please. All right, so no garden is too small. You can support our pollinator friends with even just a container garden, right? You know, we talk in the book about a container should have, you know, the old adage, a thriller, a spiller, and a filler. Wait, did I say that right? A spiller, thriller, and a filler, right? So, and those can all be pollinator plants, right? So if you just have a container, you can do pollinator gardening. If you have a sunny balcony, you can have even more. Or you can do a rooftop garden, or it can be a rain garden, or it can be your whole landscape. Final slide, please. And what I want to end with here is, of course, you guys are all making a difference in just having the beehives that you do and supporting pollinators already in the way that you do. But there's some really cool research out there that has tracked what they're calling spatial contagion, where if you have one amazing idea in a yard that's visible, you're actually inspiring others, right? And then they're going to want to do something similar in their yard. And these researchers have actually tracked how these cool ideas spread. So you actually have quite a bit of leverage to promote more pollinator habitat. And when we think about the impact that even small scale landscapes, so residential landscapes can have, the impact is profound when you think about residential properties in aggregate. And you think about the rate and speed at which gardens can go in, especially during the pandemic, right? Everybody's been doing home garden projects, right? So the speed at which these things can go in can start impacting our pollinator friends for the better right away. So thank you all for joining us today. And I think we're more than happy to entertain any questions and comments y'all might have.
Well, it's really fantastic, Danesh, and really terrific work. I know there's a little bit of a delay between the live Zoom and the live YouTube chat, so we'll give our audience on the YouTube a little bit of time to type in some questions. But one thing that really struck me about your book and about your presentation and everything you've been talking about is the application of science. One thing that just drives me crazy, and I don't want to pick on them, but just a great example of this are the flower plantings on highways, right? The beautification things. Oh, we're putting out these flowers and they're showy and they're bloomy and, you know, oh, we're helping the bees. Most of those are not pollen or nectar bearing. They're not doing anything for bees. And so the fact that, you know, you're taking, as one would expect, being horticulturist, a scientific approach about looking at the nutrition to the bees, I think is a really huge breath of fresh air that is not really shared a lot among a lot of other these lists of plants that are out there. Just because they're showy doesn't mean that they're good for bees.
Oh, thank you for that, David. And actually, it was work with the Department of Transportation in North Carolina that got me started on pollinator habitat. They were coming to us, asking us what they should plant along roadsides. And as you well know, they love their daylilies. And daylilies are notorious for being very poor, if not zero, pollinator quality forage. And so I've been working very slowly because I am but one person, and Ann and I together make essentially three people because we've got so much energy. But you know, we can only do a little bit at a time. But they are listening. But you're absolutely right. You know, and I'm letting folks add questions to the chat, so stop me at any point. But another thing that I was always struck by was that I had always heard, and this is before I knew better, my dog all of a sudden needs to go out. Let me open my door. I was going to mention that sunflowers, right? I'd always heard that bees love sunflowers. And then as I got to be in the scientific literature more and more, I learned that sunflowers aren't, it's not on the face, they're not necessarily high quality pollen. I don't know how much work you know about Jonathan's work out of Becky Irwin's lab or her stuff, but I'm going to turn it over to you for a second because my dog all of a sudden needs to go out, and I apologize for that.
I'll just jump in really, really quickly to save Danesha from her dog about the work that she was just referring to, saying that there's some work out of NC State, not in our lab, but in another lab on campus, showing that sunflower pollen can actually be used medicinally. It can actually cleanse and rid bumblebees and even honeybees of certain gut parasites. And so it can be used in a healthy way, even though nutritionally it might not be, as good, but it can serve other benefits. So that's why I think the research component is really important. And I just really appreciate that from what you guys are doing. Again, I'm just going to very quickly, I'm not going to be able to get to all the excellent questions here. I do want to point out that Joanne had pointed out, if you don't want to carry around your journal, you can carry around your cell phone to keep a record of things. And Anne, you had mentioned that after she had said that. So do you have any tips about how to use your cell phone to journal or to otherwise take notes?
So I take pictures of everything. And then the goal though is then to like download those pictures and categorize them in folders like on my computer, which ends up being, a spring break activity or a winter break activity. But then, you can have them organized chronologically. So that's really the only way you're going to be able to see how, Baptisia looks throughout the year, or, how ephemeral the Eastern Columbine is, right? Because when designing a really solid, beautiful garden, you need to know all those extra pieces, not just when it's blooming. So
yeah, no, that's a great point and a great tip. There's another question here, and I think this is a good one because this can give people some heartburn. Do you need to start these plants from seeds to achieve that intermingled look, or are there alternative ways for that?
So that's an excellent question. So, and there's a bunch of different ways you can tackle that. So if you think about designing like that with all bought plants, it can certainly be done, but it's pretty expensive. So, we're often trying to balance. So how do we get a design in where it's looking like it has some impact, but it's as easy on the pocketbook as possible? And I'm working with, so I'll come back around in a second. So you can do plants, right? You can also do plugs, which are smaller plants, but they're in these longer containers, right. And they're so full of roots that when you plant them, they just like explode and they spread readily. That's how a lot of big jobs like that go in. If you're here in Raleigh and you're at the North Carolina Museum of Art, all that cool planting near the new parking lot, that was all done with plugs. So that's another way, and they're less expensive than buying, say, like quartz or gallon perennials. The other way to do it is by direct sowing, and a lot of designers here and in Europe are doing that because it's cheap. You just have to manage expectations. So because it's going to be a mix of annuals and perennials, the perennials are not going to look lovely the first year, probably not at least until the second year, right? So right. You have to manage expectations. So I'm working on a job right now with a fellow who has quite a few honeybee hives, and he's putting in a really large pollinator habitat in his backyard. And so we went through the pros and cons of all these things. And what we've decided is we're going to do plants in the front section that he and his wife see from the house. And then we're going to seed the part behind, right? So he's going to have this beautiful garden up front. And then while the seeded area fills in and gets established and goes through its first year, that will look all amazing by next year. But they wanted to make sure that it looked good from the house. In my yard, I have planted plants, but then I always overseed with zinnia seed, right? I buy zinnia seed in bulk, and then I just broadcast that. I don't even scratch it into the ground, water that in. And that fills up all the little extra gaps. So it out competes weeds. And then At the end of the season, I just mow some of that down, and so all that organic matter just stays in the bed. So I'm pretty much a laissez-faire gardener. I like to enjoy my garden. I don't want to be out there working in it all the time.
Right. Well, we can go on and on and on all night, but I want to make sure that we cut this relatively short and cut the time off. There are many other questions here. Sorry, we couldn't get to all of them, but there were some questions. Yes, about I already put in the link to your excellent book. There were some other questions about websites that had the scientific linkages in addition to your book. And so if there's other things like that, please send those along and I'll put those into the YouTube channel. But again, thank you so much, Danesh and Ann. Fantastic discussion. I do want to just end really quickly to remind everybody that we're doing these apiculture onlines on the last Wednesdays of every month. So our next one is going to be on June 30th. Our timely topic by our genetics technician, Aaron McDermott, is going to be on counting mites because we're getting into that season again. And our guest of honor, our interviewee, is going to be Brittany Kyle, who's currently the president of the Honeybee Veterinary Consortium. And so there's been a lot of synergies between beekeeping and the veterinary world when it comes to beekeeping. And so she's really on point on all of that. And that's going to be a really excellent discussion. So thank you for attending. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, comment on our YouTube site, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Thank you again.